At 6:14 a.m., Marcus Chen thought he was about to die. The world around him trembled under the weight of more than 100 roaring engines, closing in with the slow, deliberate precision of a tide determined to swallow him whole. The gas station felt suddenly smaller, its walls shivering as the thunder grew louder, tightening into a ring no homeless teenager could ever hope to slip through. A cashier inside dropped a cup. A trucker stopped mid-sentence. Someone, barely breathing, whispered two words coded in fear and misunderstanding. Hell's Angels. And in that moment, Marcus felt the kind of stillness that comes when a life has nowhere left to run. Yet even as panic curled like smoke in the air, none of them, not the terrified onlookers, not the trembling passerby, not even Marcus himself, knew the truth buried beneath the Engine's growl. None of them knew what he had done the night before, or why the man leading this army of chrome and leather was searching for him with eyes burning not with anger, but with something far more complicated, something that looked like fire, something that looked like gratitude. And as the formation tightened, hemming Marcus into a circle forged from metal, loyalty, and a history older than he could ever imagine, the question hanging in the cold morning air was not whether he would survive, but what, exactly, these men had come to claim. Because this wasn't revenge, it was something far more terrifying. If you're here because you believe in courage and kindness, and in the moments where one small action can shift an entire life, I want to gently ask you, before we go any further, to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates stories that matter, and subscribe to the channel. It supports this work more than you know, and it helps these powerful stories reach the people who need to hear them. Thank you truly. The dawn was cold enough to bite through fabric, the kind of cold that settles into bone and refuses to leave. Frost clung to the edges of the gas station awning, trembling with every vibration rolling across the pavement. The engines that had surrounded Marcus only moments earlier now settled into a slow, thunderous idle, each one beating like a metallic heartbeat against the concrete. The air felt weighted, thick with exhaust, breath, and the unspoken fear pulsing in Marcus's chest. He stood small in the center of that wide circle of machines, a thin, exhausted teenager wrapped in his grandfather's jacket, watching as the bikers tightened around him like a living wall. Their headlights glowed through the morning haze, halos of white and gold cutting across the frost, trapping him in a ring of light that felt brighter than judgment. Every instinct he had learned on the streets. Keep your head down, stay invisible, run before anyone notices you, collapsed beneath the reality that there was nowhere left to go. The engines hummed deeper, the ground trembling beneath his feet, and Marcus couldn't stop his mind from racing. He counted faces without meaning to. Hard eyes, weathered skin, men built like human stormfronts. Every one of them wore the same symbol, stitched in a leather that looked worn from 1,000 miles of wind. The death's head emblem people whispered about in fear. Marcus swallowed hard, unable to decide whether the cold or the terror was shaking his hands. Nobody inside the gas station dared to move. A cashier froze mid-reach. A traveler near the coffee machine stepped backward as though sound alone might shatter the moment. And Marcus, alone in the center, felt every pair of eyes settle on him, heavy as the dawn. He didn't know why they were here. He didn't know what he had done to draw the attention of these men, the kind of men who rarely arrived without purpose and never in silence. All he knew was the same truth he had carried for years. Life didn't give warnings. It just hit hard when you weren't looking. And yet, beneath all that fear, one thought kept clawing its way through. Marcus didn't know he'd saved the wrong man or the right one. The line hovered in the air like an unanswered question, a breadcrumb neither he nor the audience yet understood, but one that pulled him, and us, towards something deeper, stranger, and far more impactful than he could imagine. Then, without warning, the engines cut off. The entire world fell silent in an instant. The sudden absence of sound struck harder than the noise, a jarring emptiness that made the hair on Marcus's arms rise. No rumble, no echo, just the soft hiss of cold morning air. A pattern interrupt, so sharp it felt like reality itself had skipped a beat. One man stepped forward. The others shifted slightly, almost in unison, creating a path that led straight to Marcus. Boots scraped against frost. Leather creaked. But the man at the front moved with a calm, deliberate weight, as if every step was part of a ritual older than the moment. He reached up. Gloved fingers brushed the edge of his helmet. And as he slowly removed it, the silence deepened. The world around Marcus blurred. The breath he was subconsciously holding burned in his chest, because the face revealed beneath that helmet, lined with hardship, shaped by wind, marked by miles, did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to the biker whose broken motorcycle he had repaired only hours ago. Jake, the man who'd ridden off into the night on a second chance Marcus had helped give him. The man Marcus never expected to see again. Confusion rushed in, colliding with fear, and for the first time since the engines began their march, Marcus felt something new threading through the chaos. A fragile sliver of disbelief. Why was Jake here? And why had he brought an army? Before the answers could surface, the narrator's voice drifted in softly, steadying the space between dread and revelation. If you believe bravery isn't about strength but choices, this story is for you. Watch closely. The truth behind this moment, the real reason all these men had come, would not be understood for a while longer. But already, the emotional weight had begun to shift, guiding the audience from fear into the uneasy stirrings of possibility. A moment built not just for shock, but for connection, for curiosity, for the quiet spark of wonder about what happens when kindness meets the unexpected. And as Jake stepped fully into the circle of dawn light, the story, Marcus's story, began to unfold. The cold morning and the wall of engines faded, giving way to the night before, when the world was quieter, harsher in a different way, and Marcus was just another shadow, trying to stay warm. The gas station had flickered in the darkness like a tired beacon, its neon sign buzzing with that high, electric whine that always sounded a little like loneliness. Frost clung stubbornly to the windows, turning them cloudy and dull, reflecting a teenager who barely recognized himself anymore. Marcus sat beneath the awning with his knees pulled close, the thin fabric of his jeans no match for the November chill. The only warmth he carried came from the jacket wrapped around him, frayed at the cuffs, worn smooth at the elbows, and still faintly smelling of WD-40 and Old Spice. His grandfather's jacket. He tugged it tighter around his chest, the same way he had on nights when hunger gnawed like an animal and the wind cut through every layer he owned. The jacket was more than cloth. It was memory. It was comfort. It was the last proof that someone once loved him without condition. Though his grandfather was gone, the words he'd lived by still floated through Marcus's mind whenever the world felt too big, too sharp, too uncaring. Fix what you can, son. The rest will make sense later. Simple words. Ordinary, even, but when you had nothing, they were enough to keep you moving. He rubbed his thumb along the stitched seam of the jacket as the night pressed against him. His stomach ached, empty for hours now. The cheap coffee machine inside the convenience store hissed and groaned, promising warmth he couldn't afford. He counted the last of his money, 14 crumpled singles and some change, knowing it had to stretch far longer than was realistic. But that was a problem for later. Everything in Marcus's life had become a problem for later, because the present was already too heavy. Cars came and went, their headlights sweeping past him like he didn't exist. Families hurried inside. Truckers grabbed snacks. No one looked in his direction. To them, he was just a boy with bad luck or bad choices, and either way, not worth a second glance. He'd long learned that invisibility was safer than attention. But even as he sat there, shivering in the glow of the flickering sign, something was shifting, something he couldn't feel yet, couldn't sense, couldn't possibly predict. A quiet convergence of events was forming around him, threads of fate tightening like stitches pulling a story together. Because this was the night he would meet the man whose presence would alter the course of his life. The night he would kneel beside a broken machine, lend his hands to a stranger, and unknowingly catch the attention of a brotherhood that chose its loyalties with a fierce, unbreakable devotion. But in that moment, he was just Marcus Chen, A hungry kid with dirt on his shoes, a jacket that carried the ghost of a better life, and too many unanswered questions weighing down his breath. A gust of winter wind swept past, making him shiver harder. He closed his eyes against it, hearing again the echo of his grandfather's voice, soft but certain, guiding him even now. Fix what you can. He didn't yet know that those words, offered in love years ago, were about to unfold in ways neither he nor his grandfather could have imagined. He didn't yet know that tonight's small act of kindness, rooted in those same teachings, would ripple outward and return to him in the form of 100 engines roaring at dawn. And he certainly didn't know that somewhere beyond the highway, beyond exhaustion and fear, a man riding a Harley was thinking about the strange kid who'd helped him and the debt that kindness had created. But as the flashback draws us back toward the present, one question presses forward, lingering like breath on frosted glass. But why would the Hell's Angels come for a boy with nothing? The cold night stretched on, quiet except for the occasional passing truck, until a new sound cut through the stillness. A deep, uneven rumble that sputtered like a wounded animal. Marcus lifted his head, instinctively alert. The motorcycle crawled into the gas station lot, coughing smoke as if every rotation of its engine might be its last. Its chrome, what was left of it beneath grime and road dust, caught the weak neon light, flickering across the hood of a machine that had clearly seen more miles than mercy. The man riding it looked just as worn. Jake Morrison eased the bike toward the pump, shoulders slumped beneath heavy leather, the kind that told stories of too many highways, too many nights sleeping upright, and too many regrets that wouldn't stay buried. His silver hair was wind-tangled, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to steady the handlebars. He sat there for a moment without moving, head bowed, like someone carrying the full weight of a road he didn't know how to finish. Then the engine gave out completely. A final metallic cough, a jolt, and silence. Jake closed his eyes just for a second, but in that second, Marcus recognized something familiar. Not in the face or the clothes, but in the posture. A man whose last ounce of control had just slipped away. A man who'd reached the limit of his strength and didn't know what came next. Marcus knew that feeling all too well. He shrank back in his corner instinctively, the homeless survival reflex kicking in. Don't draw attention. Don't get involved. People with problems bigger than yours can wreck your life without meaning to. And a biker? A man built like that, carrying that much sorrow under that much leather? That was someone Marcus should leave alone. But the lesson his grandfather left behind wasn't about safety. It wasn't about hiding. It was about responsibility. Fix what you can. Marcus looked down at his cold hands, then back at the motorcycle. The misfiring engine, the fuel line dripping, the exhaustion written in every line of the rider's face. He could pretend he hadn't noticed. He could stay in the shadows. No one would blame him for choosing survival over trouble. But compassion often comes disguised as trouble. And courage rarely announces itself. It just moves. Marcus stood up. His legs felt shaky, but his voice steadied itself as he stepped out into the open, fog from his breath curling into the night air. "Engine trouble?" he asked quietly. Jake lifted his head, and for the first time Marcus saw his eyes. Not angry, not wild, just tired. Deeply, painfully tired. The kind of tired that comes from years of trying to outrun mistakes that always manage to catch up. "Yeah," Jake muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, something like that." He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked into something closer to defeat. Marcus hesitated only a moment longer before kneeling beside the Harley. His hands moved with instinct he didn't have to think about. Loosening a part here, testing a connection there, feeling the machine instead of diagnosing it. His grandfather had taught him that engines were like people. You had to listen before you tried to fix anything. Jake watched him through the rising chill, confusion mingling with surprise. "You know what you're doing, kid?" Marcus shrugged. "Something still makes sense to me." In that quiet exchange, something shifted. Two strangers, one with nothing, one with more loss than he could speak aloud, stood on the edge of a moment that neither could recognize yet. A moment that would change everything. Because Marcus had no idea who he was talking to, and what brotherhood watches over their own. He didn't know that this man, exhausted and broken under the neon glow, was far more than he appeared. Not just a biker passing through. Not just a father trying to make it to a wedding. Not just another rider on the long, endless road. Jake Morrison was a name spoken with respect inside one of the most feared and loyal brotherhoods in America. A man whose word carried weight. A man whose debts meant something. But to Marcus, right now, he was simply someone who needed help. And despite every reason to stay out of it, Marcus made the decision that defined him. Not by strength, not by safety, but by choice. He helped. Marcus worked with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to understand machines long before he learned to understand people. He crouched beside the Harley, fingers moving through the cold air with practiced ease. Even without tools, even without light, he knew how to feel the carburetor's pulse, how to find the blockage choking the engine. His grandfather had always said engines were honest. They told you exactly what was wrong if you listened close enough. Jake watched, leaning heavily against the gas pump, the exhaustion in his features softening into something closer to disbelief. His rough voice broke the silence. Didn't expect to find a mechanic out here at midnight. Marcus didn't look up. I'm not a mechanic. You could have fooled me. A small sound escaped Jake, not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. More like the release of someone who'd been holding too much inside for too long. I've got to get to California, he said quietly, rubbing his hands together for warmth. My daughter, she's getting married in a few hours. Marcus's hands paused for half a second, the weight behind those words settling into the space between them. Jake continued, voice low. Haven't seen her in 5 years. Not since I missed her 16th birthday. Too many broken promises, too many nights on the road instead of being where a father should be. He exhaled sharply, fog rising in the cold. And now I've got one chance, one shot, to show up and maybe not ruin everything again. It wasn't the kind of thing a stranger usually said. But sometimes at gas stations at the edge of midnight, people talk the way they wish they could in daylight. Honest, unfiltered, afraid. Marcus understood more than he let on. He knew what it was like to be waiting for someone who never came. He knew how silence could cut deeper than anger. And he knew how regret sat heavy in the chest, refusing to budge. You think she'll want to see you? Marcus asked softly. Jake's jaw tightened. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe she's better off thinking I just didn't care enough to show. Saves her the disappointment. Marcus tightened a screw, wiped his fingers on his jeans, and stood up. He finally met Jake's eyes, tired, weathered, hopeful despite the burden he carried. Don't give up before she gets a chance to forgive you. Jake blinked, as if the words struck something deep. The kind of truth that lands because it comes from someone who's already lived its shadow. Marcus stepped back and nodded toward the bike. Try it now. Jake hesitated, then swung a leg over the seat. He turned the key, gave the starter one doubtful tap, and the engine blasted to life with a roar that tore through the silence of the night. The thunder rolled across the empty parking lot, vibrating in Marcus's chest. Jake's face transformed in the glow of the flickering gas station lights, regret twisting into something unexpectedly bright. Hope. The sound of the engine was the pattern interrupt, the jolt that neither of them saw coming. A machine once on the brink now roared like it had been reborn, ready for a road that waited with open arms. Jake's hands gripped the handlebars, steadier now, infused with purpose instead of despair. How did you? He began. Marcus shrugged again, modest, almost embarrassed. Just fix what I could. Jake stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand how a boy with so little could give something so meaningful. How someone so young could speak with a way to someone much older. But Marcus didn't linger on the moment. He stepped back into the shadows, giving Jake space. Not because he wanted to disappear, but because he didn't know how to stand in the light. Jake revved the engine once more, louder this time. A promise in the sound. A vow to not waste the chance he'd been given. Thank you, kid, he said, voice rough but sincere. You may have just saved something I thought was already gone. Marcus lifted a hand in a quiet gesture of acknowledgement. Just make it to her wedding. That's the part only you can fix. Jake nodded, something like pride flickering in his expression. Then, with a final glance at the boy who had given him hope in the middle of nowhere, He rode off into the cold night, the engine's roar carrying his determination into the distance. Marcus watched him disappear, unaware that this simple act of compassion had already set fate in motion. Unaware that the words he'd spoken, words echoing his grandfather's wisdom, were already being carried to a brotherhood bound not by blood, but by loyalty. And he had no way of knowing that tonight's small kindness would reshape the dawn in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Jake reached for his wallet as soon as the Harley settled into its steady growl, the engine rumbling with the heartbeat of renewed purpose. His hands were still shaking, not from exhaustion this time, but from the realization that he might actually make it to his daughter's wedding. He pulled out a few bills, more than Marcus had seen in one place for a long while, and held them out with the awkward sincerity of a man who wasn't used to being helped. "Here," Jake said, "for the trouble, for everything." Marcus shook his head immediately. The refusal came faster than his hunger, faster than the instinct to survive. Money would help, of course. It would help more than Jake could ever guess, but taking it felt wrong. It felt like putting a price tag on something that was never meant to be balanced in dollars. It felt like betraying the one thing his grandfather taught him that had never failed him. "I don't want anything," Marcus murmured, stepping back. "Just get to her. That's enough." Jake stared at him for a long moment, disbelief softening into something warmer, respect, maybe even admiration. "Kid, you sure?" Marcus nodded, retreating another step until the flickering neon light barely brushed his outline. The shadows swallowed him the way they had so many nights before, tucking him into the edges of the world where he felt safest. It wasn't just physical distance. It was the invisibility he'd learned to live inside. The place where people stopped asking questions, stopped noticing him, stopped seeing him at all. And yet Jake saw him now, not clearly enough to understand him, not deeply enough to know the whole story, but enough to recognize something rare, a boy who helped because it was right, not because it was profitable. Jake opened his mouth as if to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, a solemn acknowledgement between two people whose lives had intersected for a brief, fragile moment. A moment Jake knew he wouldn't forget. He tucked the money away and settled deeper onto the seat of his revived machine. The Harley rumbled beneath him, ready for the miles ahead. He gave Marcus one last look, an expression that held gratitude, hope, and the unspoken wish that the universe would be kinder to this boy than it had been to most men Jake knew. "Take care of yourself," Jake said. "You too," Marcus replied. Then Jake twisted the throttle. The engine roared, slicing through the silence of the night, echoing off the concrete and filling the empty space where words had failed. The Harley surged forward, carrying him toward the long stretch of highway lit only by moonlight and the promise of a second chance. Marcus watched the tail light fade until it slipped beyond the curve of the road and into darkness. He didn't wave. He didn't call after him. He simply stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of his grandfather's jacket, heart heavier and lighter at the same time. He'd done what he could. The rest, like his grandfather always said, would make sense later. But the night wasn't done with him yet. It breathed a quiet truth into the air around him, unseen, unheard, but already unfolding. He didn't ride off alone. He carried a story with him, one his brothers would hear by dawn. Marcus didn't know it, but the man he'd just helped wasn't traveling toward California in silence. He carried the memory of a hungry boy in the cold who chose kindness over comfort, humility over reward. And for a brotherhood bound by loyalty, honor, and debts that must be repaid, a story like that was never ignored. The night grew heavier after Jake disappeared down the highway, as if the darkness itself had settled back into place now that its brief interruption was gone. The distant hum of the Harley faded until it was nothing more than a whisper swallowed by the cold air. And then silence. A silence too big for someone as hungry, tired, and alone as Marcus Chen. He walked back toward the narrow patch of concrete where he'd been sitting before Jake arrived. The neon sign above him buzzed with its usual tired rhythm, flickering every few seconds like it was struggling to stay alive. Marcus lowered himself onto the pavement, pulling his grandfather's jacket close again. The warmth was faint now, barely enough to fight off the chill creeping into his bones. His stomach growled, sharp and hollow, the kind of hunger that felt personal. He dipped a hand into his pocket, fingers brushing over the remaining crumpled bills. $14 that felt more like a reminder of how far he still had to go than any kind of relief. For a moment, he wondered if he should have taken Jake's money. Just once. Just enough so he could eat, or buy gloves, or sleep somewhere warmer than concrete. It wasn't greed. It was survival. But Marcus wasn't built to take from people in moments of desperation. Not when he recognized the look Jake had worn. A look Marcus himself had worn countless times. A mixture of fear, regret, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow could hurt a little less. Still, doubt crept in. Was kindness a mistake? He hugged his knees tighter, resting his forehead on them as the question echoed inside his mind. Being kind had cost him before. It had cost him safety, trust, sometimes even food. And now, he'd given up the small chance to fill his stomach because something in him couldn't let a broken man walk away without the dignity of being helped freely. Was that foolishness or something else? The longer he sat in the cold, the more the world pressed inward. The neon buzz, the distant highway, the occasional car door shutting, and beneath all of it, a sense of emptiness he couldn't ignore anymore. The rush of adrenaline from helping Jake had faded, leaving him with nothing but uncertainty. Marcus closed his eyes, and then, softly, as if carried on the breath of memory, he heard it again, his grandfather's voice. "Fix what you can, son. The rest will make sense later." The words were so familiar that they felt like they lived inside him. They'd seen him through nights far worse than this one, through loss and loneliness, and every moment he'd wondered if he mattered to anyone at all. Those words were his compass, his anchor, the only inheritance he'd received from the man who'd raised him with oil-stained hands and a heart big enough for both of them. But tonight, they didn't fully quiet the storm inside him. He lifted his head and stared out at the empty road where Jake had vanished moments before. He wondered where Jake was now, whether the bike was holding up, whether the man was replaying the encounter just as Marcus was. And beneath all of that, the doubt persisted, a small, aching whisper inside him. Did kindness really matter? Did it change anything? Or did it just leave him stuck here, cold, hungry, invisible? The night stretched on, hours dripping by with the slow ache of exhaustion. Marcus stayed awake, replaying every detail. Jake's trembling hands, the tired eyes, the soft "thank you," the engine roaring back to life. He felt the weight of it. Something important had happened, even if he couldn't explain it. But nothing changed in his immediate world. He was still alone, still hungry, still a boy curled up on concrete, waiting for dawn that would bring no real answers. And yet, somewhere across state lines, racing through darkness on a restored engine, the man Marcus had helped was carrying more than gratitude. He was carrying a story that had already begun to move, already begun to gather speed, already begun to find ears willing to listen. But Marcus didn't know that. Not yet. He only knew the cold, the ache, and the echo of a lesson his grandfather left behind, one he clung to now with fragile hope. Fix what you can. The first hint of dawn hadn't even touched the sky when Marcus heard it. So faint at first, he almost mistook it for the groan of distant trucks. But trucks didn't make the earth pulse. Trucks didn't send shivers crawling up your spine. Trucks didn't rise and swell until the sound became a living force marching out of the darkness. Marcus lifted his head. The engines were coming. A low, rolling thunder built layer by layer, growing deeper, louder, heavier, until even the neon sign above him began to flicker in rhythm with the approaching storm. The empty road trembled beneath the sound. The windows of the convenience store rattled, bottles inside humming like tuning forks. The cashier froze mid-motion. A man pumping gas looked toward the road, keys falling from his hand. Marcus felt it before he fully understood it. The unmistakable vibration of dozens of machines moving as one. Engines. Many engines. He scrambled to his feet, breath catching in his chest. The rumble grew until it felt like the ground might crack under the weight of it. And then they appeared, one by one at first, then 10, then 20, then an unbroken formation stretching across the horizon. Hell's Angels, leather cuts, marked with death's head, patches gleamed under the weak dawn light. Chrome caught fire in the dimness, reflecting long shadows across the asphalt. 120 motorcycles rolled toward the gas station in perfect unison. No wavering, no drifting, just raw precision that carried the quiet power of a well-disciplined army. Marcus's blood turned cold. He stepped back, heart pounding so violently it almost hurt. Everything inside him screamed to run, to hide, to disappear into the cracks of the world the way he always had. But he couldn't move. He could only stare as the convoy approached, engines roaring like a storm that refused to break. The first bike entered the lot, then another, and another. 120 engines circling the pumps, closing in with the slow inevitability of a tide he couldn't escape. The circle tightened around him, walls of steel and leather forming a boundary he couldn't cross. Marcus braced himself for the worst. The first rider killed his engine, then the second, then the third. A wave of silence swept across the lot as one by one the machines quieted until the entire formation sat still, idling no more, breathing no more, just watching him. A silence thick enough to drown in. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of hostility, instead of aggression, instead of the danger Marcus felt certain would follow, the riders adjusted their bikes outward ever so slightly. A small shift, a tiny gesture, but unmistakably clear. They weren't trapping him. They were sheltering him. A protective circle. The realization struck him so hard his knees wobbled. His mind tried to make sense of it, but the moment offered no clarity, only shock, confusion, and a growing sense of awe he didn't know how to hold. The formation parted at the front. A single rider rolled forward from the line. His bike gleamed with authority, his posture steady, his presence unmistakable. The man removed his helmet with slow, deliberate purpose, as though the act itself held meaning. And Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Jake, but not the Jake he'd met last night. Not the worn-down man slumped over his failing Harley. No, this Jake carried himself like someone who had remembered who he was, like someone with a name that meant something. His leather cut bore patches Marcus didn't understand, but instantly recognized as symbols of respect and rank. His shoulders were squared, his spine straight, his eyes sharp with purpose and pride. A leader, a brother among brothers. Marcus stared, unable to speak, unable to breathe. Jake dismounted with a confidence that felt worlds away from the desperation Marcus had seen only hours before. He walked toward the center of the circle, toward the boy who had helped him without asking for anything in return, his boots heavy on the frost-covered ground. And for a moment, Marcus felt the strangest sensation. Overwhelm, awe, disbelief, because the truth began to dawn on him, slowly, humbly, like the first light breaking over a horizon. They hadn't come to hurt him. They hadn't come for violence. They had come because Jake had carried a story with him into the night. A story about a boy with nothing who gave everything he had to help a stranger. A story that traveled fast through the kind of brotherhood that never forgot a debt of honor. And these men, feared by most of the world, were here for only one reason: to honor Marcus Chen, the boy who had saved one of their own. Jake stepped fully into the circle, the frost crunching beneath his boots, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. 120 riders stood or sat in stillness, their presence heavy but no longer threatening, more like guardians than warriors. Marcus, shivering in the center, felt their eyes on him, but this time the weight wasn't fear pressing into his chest. It was something else, something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to recognition. Jake approached until he stood just a few feet away. The lines of exhaustion that had marked his face the night before were softened now, replaced by a steadiness that made him look 10 years younger. He took a long breath, as if steadying emotions he wasn't used to showing, then placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You," Jake said quietly, voice thick, made sure I didn't miss the most important day of my daughter's life. The riders shifted, not in aggression, but in agreement. A ripple of respect moved through them, silent but powerful. Jake continued, his words carrying the gravity of a man who had lived too much and regretted even more. When I rode out of here last night, I wasn't sure I deserved to show up at that wedding. I wasn't sure she'd even want me there. But I heard your voice the whole way down that highway. He paused, eyes locked on Marcus with a depth that made the boy feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. Don't give up before she gets a chance to forgive you, Jake said, repeating Marcus's own words back to him. His voice grew steadier, stronger. You gave me the chance to try. Marcus felt something tighten in his throat. Those words, his own words, coming from a man like Jake, surrounded by a brotherhood like this, it did something inside him. Something that made him stand a little straighter despite the cold. Something that warmed a place in him that had been numb for far too long. Jake lifted a hand then, signaling to his brothers. And the gifts began. One biker stepped forward first, pulling a pack of sandwiches and wrapped food from his saddlebag. He didn't speak. He simply held the food out to Marcus with a nod that carried more sincerity than any speech. Marcus blinked in disbelief before taking it. Another biker followed, dropping a bundle of bills into Marcus's palm. For the road, he murmured before stepping back. Another pressed a pair of gloves into his hands, thick, warm, worn in the way that made them perfect for long nights. Another handed him a thermos. Another offered socks. Someone else placed a folded blanket over his shoulder. There was no pity in their gestures, no charity, just respect, a recognition of a debt they intended to repay properly. Marcus looked down at the growing collection in his arms, food, money, gear, warmth, and something inside him broke and healed at the same time. Nobody had given him anything like this in years. Nobody had looked at him with anything other than suspicion or annoyance or avoidance. But these men were offering him more than supplies. They were offering him dignity. Jake moved to stand beside him again, and his voice carried through the crisp morning air. Brothers, this young man didn't know me a damn thing. Didn't know me. Didn't have anything to gain. But he fixed that bike like it mattered. He talked to me like I still had a place in this world. And because of him, I saw my daughter walk down the aisle yesterday. Because of him, she hugged me like she'd been waiting 5 years to stop being angry. A stir rippled through the circle. Pride, approval, warmth wrapped inside the stoic exterior of leather and steel. Jake's voice lowered, but the emotion in it hit harder. And I'll tell you something else. The moment I saw her smiling, I realized I wasn't the only one he saved. Jake turned fully toward Marcus. You save her too, son. The word son slipped out naturally, like something Jake hadn't planned, but felt anyway. And Marcus felt its impact like a blow to the ribs, sharp, unexpected, but somehow right. For a heartbeat, Marcus couldn't breathe. The world around him blurred, not from cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming sensation of belonging, of matching, of being seen not as a burden or a stray, but as someone worthy of gratitude, someone worthy of honor. He swallowed, hard, unsure what to say, unsure if he could speak at all, but words weren't needed. The moment spoke loud enough. Jake gave his shoulder another firm squeeze. You didn't fix just a bike last night. You fixed a father's last chance. Marcus lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by emotion so heavy it felt sacred. He had helped because it was right, because he couldn't watch a man give up, because his grandfather had taught him to fix what he could. He never expected this. And as Jake stepped back, the circle of bikers closed in, not to trap him, but to welcome him. One nod at a time, one gesture at a time, one sign of respect after another. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel like a ghost drifting through the world. He felt included. He felt validated. He felt like he belonged. Jake stepped forward once more, the brotherhood quieting behind him as if the very air understood something important was about to be spoken. The dawn had fully broken now, soft gray light settling over the gas station, catching on chrome, on leather, on the frost that glimmered like a second skin across the concrete. Marcus stood still at the center, arms full of unexpected gifts, heart full of emotions he had no map for. Respect, warmth, belonging. It all felt too big, too sudden, too unreal. Jake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small, a business card, edges worn, ink slightly faded from years of being carried close. He held it out to Marcus with the same care one might offer something fragile, something meaningful. "This is my garage," Jake said. "Sacramento. Been running a long time. We fix everything from engines to old mistakes when we can." His voice softened. "You've got the hands for it, the instinct, the heart, and I've been looking for someone like that for years." Marcus blinked, his breath hitching. "You want me to work for you?" Jake shook his head gently. "No, I want you to work with me." He let that word hang there, heavy with significance. Then he continued. "You'd have a job there. Real pay, real training, and a room above the shop if you need it. Warm bed, hot meals, a door that locks, a place to wake up without wondering what you'll lose overnight." Marcus's grip tightened on the blanket draped over his arm. His throat felt too small for his voice. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet," Jake replied. "Just know the offer is real, and it's yours if you want it." The emotion building in Marcus's chest swelled until he had to look away. His gaze drifted down to his grandfather's jacket, the worn fabric, the stitching coming undone along the seam, the faint scent of oil and aftershave that had never fully faded. His fingers lifted almost on their own, brushing gently over the frayed collar. This jacket had been his last link to a man who taught him how to make sense of the world, who showed him how to turn broken things into working ones, who believed that even if life didn't give you much, you could still give something back. "Fix what you can, son." Marcus had lived by those words because they were all he had left. But now something inside him shifted. As his fingertips pressed into the fabric, a realization bloomed warm and bright in his chest. He hadn't just fixed Jake's bike. He hadn't just helped a stranger in trouble. He had stepped into the future his grandfather always wanted for him. A future where his talent meant something, where his kindness wasn't swallowed by the world, where his hands were used not just to survive, but to build, to create, to belong. Jake watched him with quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what was unfolding behind Marcus's eyes. "You gave me back my daughter," Jake said softly. "Let me give you something too. A home, a chance, a family that stands by its own." Marcus's breath trembled. The word family hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just a promise. It was a lifeline thrown across the chasm of everything he'd lost. "But why me?" Marcus whispered. Jake stepped closer, lowering his voice to something almost fatherly. "Because you didn't owe me a thing. Because you showed up when you didn't have to. Because you saw a man at his lowest and treated him like he still mattered." He paused, letting the truth sink in. "And because anyone with that kind of heart deserves a place where it's valued." Marcus swallowed hard, emotion tightening his chest until he felt it might crack open. Was this real? Could be real? A job, a place to sleep, people who respected him, a future shaped by the very skills his grandfather had lovingly placed in his hands. Destiny didn't usually announce itself, but right now, standing in a circle formed by men who had crossed a state line to honor him, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. A path opening beneath his feet. A direction. A purpose. A possibility. Jake placed the business card gently into his hand. "Call when you're ready," he said. "No pressure. No expectations. Just a door waiting for you to walk through." Marcus closed his fingers around the card, feeling its weight, small but heavier with meaning than anything he'd ever held. His grandfather's words echoed once more, steady now, no longer faint. "Fix what you can, son. The rest will make sense later." For the first time, Marcus believed they might finally be coming true. One by one, the engines roared back to life, the thunder rising again, but this time it didn't shake the ground with fear. It lifted the air with something fuller, warmer, as if the sound itself carried gratitude. The riders gave Marcus nods that felt like signed pledges, silent vows for men who didn't offer their respect lightly. Jake lingered longer than the rest, his gaze steady, not rushed, holding Marcus in a way that said the offer was real, the bond was real, and the door to a new life was already open. With a final tap on the clutch and a brief, knowing smile, Jake pulled back into formation. Then the convoy moved as one. A tidal wave of chrome and leather rolled past Marcus, surrounding him for a final moment before peeling away onto the open road. Engines echoed across the waking city, their growl fading into the distance like a storm passing over a landscape it had no intention of harming. The sound grew weaker, softer, until at last it disappeared entirely. Silence returned, but it was not the lonely silence of the night before. This silence felt sacred, like the earth was giving Marcus space to understand what had just happened. He stood alone in the cold dawn, arms still holding the blanket, food, and small offerings pressed upon him. In one pocket, the business card. In the other, the warmth of something long dormant, hope. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply breathed, letting the quiet settle onto him like a second skin. The gas station looked the same as it had hours earlier. The flickering neon, the frost on the windows, the empty parking lot, but nothing inside Marcus remained unchanged. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't forgotten. And for the first time in years, the weight in his chest didn't feel like loss. It felt like possibility. Marcus looked down at his grandfather's jacket. His fingers traced the worn seams, the fabric that had seen so many nights like this one. Except this night, something different had emerged. He thought of Jake's promise. He thought of the thunder of engines forming a protective circle. He thought of the way those men looked at him, not as a stray kid, not as a problem, but as someone who mattered, someone worth writing for. Slowly, Marcus lifted his backpack onto his shoulder. The motion was simple, but the meaning behind it felt enormous, like he was picking up not just his belongings, but the thread of a life he'd long stopped believing he could still weave together. He took a single step, then another. The highway stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but no longer empty. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice again, soft, steady, urging him forward. Fix what you can, son. The rest will make sense later. Marcus tightened his grip on the business card in his pocket, feeling the imprint of Jake's name beneath his thumb. Sacramento wasn't close. It wasn't easy, but it was a direction, a destination, a place where he wasn't just passing through, but possibly finally arriving. So he began to walk. The cold nipped at his cheeks. The sky warmed to pale gold. The world felt larger, but no longer threatening. He walked with a slow, steady confidence, each step carrying him farther from the boy who had shivered alone under neon lights, and closer to the young man who had been seen, valued, and chosen. He walked toward work, toward shelter, toward family, toward the version of himself his grandfather had always believed in, toward home. And as the narrator's voice settled gently over the path unfolding ahead of him, the truth of this story crystallized into a single, powerful message. Sometimes family isn't the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the ones who hear your kindness and come roaring back for you. The road opened before him, long, uncertain, beautiful. Marcus took another step, then another, and didn't look back. As Marcus made his way down that long stretch of highway, the truth of his journey continued to echo long after the engines faded, a reminder that kindness is never wasted, not even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. And if you've stayed with us through this story, if something in it stirred your heart even a little, I want to gently invite you to be part of something bigger. There are people out there who look away from kids like Marcus. People who step over them, judge them, ignore them, people who choose indifference over humanity. If you believe that no one should be forgotten, not left in the cold, not silenced by circumstance, then let your voice be part of this moment. If you stand with kindness instead of cruelty, if you believe every small act matters, if you choose compassion over turning your back, then tap subscribe, because those who choose apathy never will. And if you're the kind of person who refuses to let the world keep treating kids like Marcus as invisible, drop a comment saying, "I stand with the good." Every comment pushes stories like this to the people who need them most, and every like, every share helps drown out the voices that say nothing we do matters. So share this video with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment, to take a stand. And subscribe if you believe the world needs more courage, more loyalty, more moments where ordinary people choose to do what's right, even when no one's watching. Because kindness has its own kind of thunder, and when it returns, it always comes roaring.